There are few things that test your self-respect more than being rejected by someone you wanted to be chosen by. It may be a message they never answered, a conversation that suddenly went cold, a room where you felt invisible, or a person who once made you feel important and then slowly treated you like you were easy to replace. And what makes rejection so painful is not only that someone said no, it is that something inside you starts asking, "What does this say about me?" That is the dangerous moment, because if you are not careful, rejection does not just hurt you, it starts directing you. It makes you chase explanations. It makes you check your phone. It makes you replay your words, your appearance, your mistakes, your timing. It turns one person's distance into a judgment on your entire worth. And without noticing it, you begin giving more power to the person who pulled away than you give to your own character. This is where reverse psychology becomes more than a social trick. It is not about manipulation. It is not about pretending you do not care so someone comes back. It is not about making them jealous, punishing them with silence, or becoming cold just because you were hurt. Real reverse psychology, in the Stoic sense, means doing the opposite of what wounded pride demands. Pain wants you to chase. You pause. Pain wants you to explain yourself. You become quiet. Pain wants you to prove your value to the person who refused to see it. You return to the work of becoming valuable in your own eyes. The Stoics understood something that modern life keeps forgetting. You do not control who accepts you, who chooses you, who notices you, or who walks away. But you do control whether their rejection becomes the master of your mind. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself again and again that the external world could touch the body, reputation, position, and circumstance, but the inner ruling faculty had to remain its own. In simple words, other people may decide not to value you, but they do not get to decide whether you abandon yourself. So these 10 lessons are not about revenge. They are about recovery of power. They are about learning how to meet rejection without collapsing, without begging, without performing, and without turning your pain into a spectacle. Because the moment you stop trying to be chosen by someone who has already stepped away, you create space for something stronger to return. Dignity, clarity, discipline, and the quiet confidence of a person who no longer needs rejection to explain who they are. The first lesson is to ignore their indifference without losing your dignity. When someone ignores you, the first instinct is usually to close the gap. You want to send one more message, ask one more question, explain one more time, make one more attempt to prove that you are worth answering. And at first, it can feel reasonable. You tell yourself you only want clarity, you only want honesty, you only want to understand what changed. But beneath that need for clarity, there is often something more painful happening. You're trying to get your value confirmed by the very person who made you doubt it. This is where many people lose themselves. They do not lose themselves because they were rejected. They lose themselves because they start negotiating with rejection. They keep placing their peace in front of someone who has already shown carelessness with it. They keep returning to the same silence, hoping it will finally speak. They keep staring at the same closed door, hoping it will become proof that they were not foolish for knocking. But Stoicism asks for something harder and cleaner. It asks you to stop treating another person's indifference as an emergency. Their silence is information, not a sentence. Their lack of attention is a signal, not a verdict. Their refusal to see your worth does not become truth unless you begin living as if it is truth. To ignore their indifference does not mean you become rude, bitter, or performative. It does not mean you walk around trying to look unaffected while secretly building your entire emotional life around proving a point. That is still attachment wearing a mask. Real dignity is quieter. It says, I notice what happened. I understand what this means, and I will not reduce myself to compete for basic respect. There is a difference between being ignored and making yourself invisible. When someone ignores you, that is their action. When you abandon your own standards to win their attention, that becomes your action. And this is the part you control. You cannot force someone to respond with warmth. You cannot force someone to choose you with sincerity. You cannot force someone to recognize your presence. But you can decide that their inability to value you will not make you act without value. This is the reverse psychology of self-respect. The wounded part of you says, move closer, try harder, make them see. But wisdom says, step back, stand still. Let reality reveal itself. Because sometimes the most powerful response to being overlooked is not to demand visibility from the person who made you feel unseen. It is to stop organizing your energy around them. Think of a moment when someone's distance began to occupy too much space in your mind. Maybe you were in a group conversation and they barely acknowledged you. Maybe you reached out and felt the coldness in their reply. Maybe someone you cared about slowly became less available, less interested, less present. And because the change was subtle, you kept trying to decode it. You wondered if you said something wrong, if you were too much, if you were not enough, if there was still a way to pull them back. But that decoding becomes a trap. The more you study their distance, the more you distance yourself from your own life. You stop asking, what kind of person am I becoming? And start asking, how do I make them respond? That is the moment rejection begins to shrink you. A Stoic does not waste the mind on what is not in his command. This does not mean he feels nothing. It means he refuses to let feeling become slavery. So when someone treats you with indifference, your task is not to mirror their immaturity. Your task is to protect your own order. You return to your work. You return to your body. You return to your responsibilities. You return to the people who meet you with respect. You return to the habits that strengthen your inner life. Not because you are pretending they do not matter, but because you matter too much to disappear into their absence. And here is the sharp truth. If someone only notices your worth when you withdraw, they were not responding to your value. They were responding to the loss of access. Do not confuse that with love. Do not confuse that with respect. Do not confuse attention after distance with genuine recognition. Your goal is not to become a strategy that makes people panic. Your goal is to become a person who no longer panics when someone pulls away. That is why ignoring their indifference must come from dignity, not ego. Ego says, I will ignore you so you suffer. Dignity says, I will not chase what diminishes me. Ego wants a reaction. Dignity wants peace. Ego is still tied to them. Dignity returns you to yourself. And this is where the second lesson begins. Do not react emotionally. Rejection becomes dangerous when it catches you in the first wave. The first wave is hot, fast, and usually unwise. It is the impulse to send the long message, the impulse to demand an explanation, the impulse to post something indirect, the impulse to prove that you are not hurt by acting louder than the hurt itself. This is the moment when many people turn a wound into a performance. But the first emotion is not always the truest guide. It may be real, but real does not mean reliable. Anger can be real and still make you foolish. Sadness can be real and still make you beg. Fear can be real and still make you cling to something that is already costing you your peace. The Stoic path does not ask you to deny the emotion. It asks you not to obey it before you have examined it. When someone rejects you, pause before you respond, not because silence is a tactic, but because reaction is expensive. One emotional response can give away more than you intended. It can reveal that your center is outside of you. It can show that another person's distance has immediate control over your words, your posture, your mood, and your self-image. And once you train yourself to react every time you feel wounded, you become easy to move. Anyone who withholds attention can pull you into chaos. Marcus Aurelius wrote often about the space between impression and judgment. Something happens outside you, and then your mind gives it meaning. Someone does not respond. That is the event. But then the mind says, "I am unwanted." Someone chooses someone else. That is the event. But then the mind says, "I am not enough." Someone walks away. That is the event. But then the mind says, "I have been abandoned because I am unworthy." The pain often comes not only from what happened, but from the story your mind attaches to what happened. This is why emotional control is not coldness, it is accuracy. It is the discipline of saying, "Let me see what actually happened before I surrender to the meaning my insecurity created." Maybe someone rejected you because they were careless. Maybe they were immature. Maybe they were not aligned with you. Maybe they had their own fears, preferences, wounds, or limitations. Maybe the door closed because it was never the right door. But if your first conclusion is always, "This proves something is wrong with me," then rejection will keep becoming a weapon you use against yourself. So the practice is simple, but not easy. When the rejection hits, do not rush to explain yourself. Do not rush to accuse. Do not rush to collapse. Let the first wave pass. Breathe. Walk. Step away from the phone. Return to your body before you respond from your wound. Ask yourself, what part of me is speaking right now? Is this dignity, or is this panic? Is this clarity, or is this wounded pride? Am I about to act in a way my stronger self will respect tomorrow? This question can save you from many humiliations. Because rejection often tempts you to abandon your own standards just to reduce the pain quickly. You may want to beg because begging feels like action. You may want to argue because arguing feels like control. You may want to insult because insult feels like power. But none of these are power. They are pain trying to find somewhere to go. Real power is the ability to feel the sting and still choose the response, to be disappointed and still remain composed, to feel the ego burning and still refuse to become small. That is not weakness. That is mastery. Anyone can react when hurt. Very few can be hurt and still remain aligned with who they claim to be. And this is where rejection becomes training. Every moment of rejection asks a private question. Who governs you? Is it the person who did not choose you? Is it the message you did not receive? Is it the image you had of how things should have gone? Or is there something deeper in you, something steadier, something that can absorb pain without letting pain take command? The Stoic answer is not to become numb. A numb person is not strong. A numb person has simply shut the door on life. The answer is to become disciplined enough to feel without being ruled. You can admit, "This hurt me," without turning that hurt into begging. You can admit, "I wanted this," without making your desire a chain. You can admit, "I feel rejected," without letting rejection define your identity. That is the beginning of turning rejection into power. Not because the rejection disappears, but because your relationship to it changes. You stop asking it to explain your worth. You stop letting it dictate your behavior. You stop handing your inner state to someone who may not even understand the damage they caused. And once you stop reacting from the wound, you create space for a stronger question. Not, why did they reject me? But, what is this rejection trying to reveal about where I still give my power away? The third lesson is to remove them from your mind. This may sound simple, but it is one of the hardest parts of rejection, because the body can walk away long before the mind does. You may stop texting them, you may stop seeing them, you may stop asking questions out loud, but inside they are still there. Their silence becomes a room you keep entering. Their rejection becomes a sentence you keep rereading. Their opinion becomes a shadow that follows you into ordinary moments, while you're working, eating, driving, lying in bed, trying to sleep, trying to act normal. This is where rejection becomes more than an event. It becomes occupation. Someone leaves, but they remain in your attention. Someone refuses you, but they still control the weather inside your mind. You are not speaking to them anymore, but you are still arguing with them privately. You are still imagining what you should have said. You are still hoping they will realize something. You are still building conversations that may never happen. And slowly, without noticing it, you give a person who stepped away the most expensive thing you own, your mental space. The Stoics understood that attention is not a small thing. What you repeatedly place in the mind begins to shape the mind. If you keep returning to resentment, resentment becomes familiar. If you keep returning to humiliation, humiliation becomes part of your identity. If you keep returning to a person who rejected you, not physically but mentally, then even their absence becomes a kind of presence. So removing them from your mind does not mean pretending they never mattered. That is childish. It does not mean forcing yourself to forget them instantly. That is unrealistic. It means you stop feeding the mental loop that keeps making them central. You stop turning every quiet moment into a trial where you present evidence for why they should have treated you differently. You stop giving your imagination permission to keep reopening a wound that reality has already shown you. There is a difference between grieving and obsessing. Grieving allows pain to move through you. Obsessing keeps pain sitting on the throne. Grieving says, "This mattered, and I need time to process it." Obsessing says, "I will not be free until I understand every detail, every motive, every hidden reason." But sometimes there is no satisfying explanation. Sometimes the explanation is simple and brutal. They did not choose you with the care you hoped for. And if you keep demanding a deeper answer from someone's distance, you may waste months trying to decode what only needed to be accepted. This is why mental detachment is not denial. It is discipline. It is the decision to stop letting one rejection become the main story of your life. You may still feel the ache. You may still remember the words. You may still have moments where the mind drifts back. But each time it does, you practice returning. Not dramatically, not with hatred, simply, quietly, firmly. No, I will not spend another hour living inside someone else's decision. And this is where reverse psychology becomes powerful. The wounded mind says, think about them until you solve the pain. Wisdom says, stop feeding the thought, and the pain will lose authority. The wounded mind says, replay the rejection until you understand your worth. Wisdom says, your worth will never be found inside the mind of someone who did not know how to honor it. A practical way to do this is to rebuild your attention with intention. Do not merely say, I will stop thinking about them. The mind does not obey empty commands for long. Give it something stronger to hold. Return to your work with seriousness. Move your body. Clean your space. Read something that restores order. Spend time with people who do not make you question your basic value. Start something small that belongs entirely to you. Because when rejection has made your world narrow, growth is how you widen it again. And be careful with the secret rituals that keep attachment alive. Checking their profile, reading old messages, interpreting their silence, watching who they follow, creating imaginary signs from small details. These things may look harmless, but they keep the rejection fresh. Every time you go looking for them, you teach your mind that they are still the source of meaning. You reopen the same door and act surprised that the same pain is still inside. A stronger person does not become strong by pretending not to care. A stronger person becomes strong by deciding what deserves continued access to their attention. If someone has already shown that they cannot meet you with respect, then they should not keep receiving the privilege of living rent-free in your mind. Their rejection may have been outside your control, but your repeated return to it is now your responsibility. This is not easy, and it should not be made to sound easy. Some people touch deep places in us. Some rejection awakens old wounds that were there before the person arrived. It may remind you of not being chosen in childhood, not being seen in your family, not being enough in places where you tried hard to earn love. And this is why the work must go deeper than simply move on. Sometimes you are not just trying to detach from a person. You're trying to detach from the old belief that their rejection proves the story you already feared was true. That is why you must be firm with the mind, but not cruel to yourself. Do not insult yourself for caring. Do not shame yourself for needing time. But do not romanticize your suffering either. Pain is not proof of depth. Sometimes pain is only proof that you keep touching the wound. And there comes a point where healing requires you to stop asking the rejected version of yourself to keep explaining what happened. Remove them from your mind by returning authority to your own life. Let your attention become a guarded place. Let your inner world become too valuable to be occupied by people who only brought confusion. Let your thoughts serve your becoming, not your humiliation. Because when your mind stops orbiting the person who rejected you, you do not lose something. You recover the space where your future can finally begin speaking again. And once your mind begins to reclaim its space, the next step is not only internal. Sometimes peace requires a visible boundary. Sometimes the wound cannot close while the same person keeps receiving access to your life. The fourth lesson is to cut off contact and reclaim your peace. There is a kind of contact that does not create connection. It only keeps the wound active. A short message, a quick check-in, a casual reply, a small excuse to reopen the door. You tell yourself it is harmless. You tell yourself you are mature enough to handle it. You tell yourself you just want to keep things peaceful. But if every small contact leaves you anxious, hopeful, disappointed, or emotionally unstable, then you are not keeping peace. You are keeping access to the thing that disturbs it. Cutting off contact is often misunderstood. People hear it and imagine cruelty, punishment, or childish silent treatment. But in its mature form, no contact is not about making the other person suffer. It is about ending the cycle in which you keep suffering for the chance to be noticed. It is not a performance. It is not a game. It is not a strategy to provoke regret. It is a boundary placed around a nervous system that has been pulled too often into uncertainty. When someone rejects you, especially if the rejection is unclear, inconsistent, or emotionally confusing, continued access can become dangerous. You may begin living for crumbs. A delayed reply feels like hope. A kind word feels like a sign. A cold tone feels like punishment. You become emotionally dependent on small fluctuations in someone else's behavior. That is not love. That is instability. And if you keep calling instability connection, you will keep confusing anxiety with attachment. The Stoic response is not to beg life to become easier. It is to remove unnecessary disturbance where you can. If a person's presence repeatedly drags you away from your center, then distance becomes wisdom. You do not need hatred to step back. You do not need a dramatic final speech. You do not need to prove that they were wrong. Sometimes the most powerful sentence is the one you never send. Sometimes the cleanest ending is not an explosion. It is the quiet removal of access. This is where many people fail. They cut contact physically, but not emotionally. They stop messaging but keep waiting. They stop calling but keep monitoring. They stop asking but keep hoping the other person will notice the silence and return with a confession. That is not no contact. That is emotional bargaining in disguise. True distance means you are not using silence as bait. You are using silence as shelter, and shelter matters. Because after rejection, the mind needs a place where it is not constantly triggered. You need time where you are not interpreting every signal. You need days where your mood is not controlled by whether someone looked at your story, replied to your message, mentioned your name, or appeared online. Peace does not return while the wound is being touched every few hours. It returns when the wound is given protection. Cutting off contact also reveals something uncomfortable: how much of your identity was tied to their attention. At first, the silence may feel unbearable because you are not only missing them, you are missing the version of yourself you felt around them. You are missing the hope. You are missing the imagined future. You are missing the feeling that maybe, if you just found the right words, things could return to what they were. But discipline begins when you stop confusing emotional withdrawal with evidence that you made the wrong decision. There will be moments when your mind tries to negotiate. Maybe I should just ask how they are. Maybe I should explain one last time. Maybe they misunderstood me. Maybe I am being too harsh. And sometimes, yes, mature communication matters. But there is a difference between speaking for clarity and speaking because silence makes you uncomfortable. There's a difference between resolving something and reopening something that has already shown you its pattern. So before you break your own boundary, ask yourself, what am I actually seeking right now? If the honest answer is comfort, validation, reassurance, revenge, or proof that they still care, then pause. Because you are not reaching out from strength, you are reaching out from hunger, and hunger will make you accept emotional scraps that your grounded self would reject. A Stoic does not treat peace as a luxury. He treats it as a duty, not because life should always feel calm, but because a disturbed mind makes poor choices. When your inner world is chaotic, you misread people. You exaggerate signs. You mistake longing for love. You mistake silence for mystery. You mistake inconsistency for depth. And that is how rejection can pull you into a longer humiliation than the rejection itself. To cut off contact is to say, I cannot control whether you value me, but I can control whether I keep placing myself where I am devalued. That sentence must become more than an idea. It must become behavior. It means you stop initiating conversations that leave you smaller. You stop creating excuses to stay connected to someone who already disconnected from you emotionally. You stop reopening doors that only lead you back into confusion. This is not weakness. It takes strength to walk away without applause. It takes strength to choose peace when the ego wants one more attempt. It takes strength to leave the message unwritten, the call unmade, the explanation unsent. And slowly that strength begins to change you, not because the other person finally understands your worth, but because you finally stop abandoning it. And the moment you stop abandoning your peace, another hidden habit becomes visible. The habit of begging for attention without calling it begging. The fifth lesson is to stop begging for attention. Begging does not always look like begging. Sometimes it looks like over-explaining. Sometimes it looks like being too available. Sometimes it looks like laughing at disrespect so you do not seem difficult. Sometimes it looks like lowering your standards 1 inch at a time until you are grateful for treatment that once would have offended you. Most people do not lose their dignity all at once. They lose it through small negotiations with their own self-respect. When you are rejected, the temptation to earn attention becomes powerful. You may start performing a better version of yourself. More interesting, more attractive, more agreeable, more patient, more forgiving. You begin asking, "What can I become so they will choose me?" But hidden inside that question is a dangerous surrender. You are allowing someone else's lack of recognition to become the sculptor of your identity. The Stoic path cuts through this. Your worth cannot depend on being noticed, because if your worth depends on attention, then whoever controls attention controls you. If they reply, you rise. If they ignore you, you collapse. If they praise you, you feel real. If they withhold warmth, you disappear inside yourself. That is not confidence. That is emotional dependence dressed as hope. To stop begging for attention means you stop auditioning for a place in someone's life. You stop bending your personality into shapes that are easier for them to accept. You stop confusing pursuit with proof of love. You stop trying to convince people to offer what should only be given freely. Respect, presence, honesty, care. This does not mean you become arrogant. Arrogance still needs an audience. Arrogance says, "Look how little I need you." Self-respect says nothing. It simply stops participating in situations where it must plead for basic regard. There is a calmness in that, a clean refusal, not loud, not dramatic, just final in a way the soul understands. And here is the part many people do not want to admit. Sometimes you are not begging because the other person is extraordinary. You are begging because their rejection activated your fear. You are not always attached to who they are. Sometimes you are attached to what their acceptance would have proved. If they choose you, maybe you are lovable. If they return, maybe you are enough. If they regret losing you, maybe the wound finally closes. But this gives another person too much authority over an answer that must come from your own inner life. No one should carry the power to decide whether you are enough. That is too much power for any human being, especially one who has already shown uncertainty toward you. When you beg for attention, you are not only asking to be seen, you are handing over the right to define you, and the price is always higher than it appears. So what do you do instead? You become harder to emotionally purchase with small gestures. You stop treating crumbs like a feast. You stop responding immediately to people who respond to you only when it is convenient. You stop rewarding inconsistency with more devotion. You stop making yourself endlessly available to someone who has made you optional. And then you put that energy somewhere worthy, into your discipline, into your health, into your craft, into your friendships, into your relationship with your own mind, into the quiet rebuilding of a life that does not require one person's attention to feel meaningful. This is not a distraction from rejection. It is the proper use of the energy rejection released. Because attention is not the same as respect. Someone can notice you and still not honor you. Someone can desire access to you and still not value you. Someone can come back because your absence disturbed their ego, not because their heart became mature. Do not be so hungry for attention that you mistake any return for real recognition. The deeper victory is when you no longer need to be chased by the person who made you feel rejected. You no longer need them to admit they were wrong. You no longer need them to watch your life improve. You no longer need their regret as evidence of your power. You simply become more rooted, more selective, more loyal to your own peace. That is when rejection starts losing its grip. Not because everyone suddenly chooses you, but because you stop choosing yourself last. You stop treating attention as oxygen. You stop shrinking your life into the question of whether one person sees you. And when that happens, something very quiet but very strong begins to return. You start feeling like your own person again. And once you become your own person again, the next challenge is not merely walking away. It is learning how to remain decent without becoming emotionally available to those who have not earned access to your inner world. The sixth lesson is to be kind, but emotionally distant. One of the most dangerous mistakes after rejection is believing you only have two choices: become cold or become available. So people swing between extremes. One day they want to prove they are mature, kind, understanding, and above the pain. The next day they feel humiliated by how much access they gave to someone who did not treat them with the same care. They confuse kindness with openness. They confuse forgiveness with re-entry. They confuse emotional maturity with allowing the same person to keep touching the same wound. But Stoicism does not ask you to become harsh. It asks you to become governed. There is a difference. A harsh person reacts from injury. A governed person responds from principle. A harsh person wants the other person to feel the pain they caused. A governed person refuses to let pain decide their conduct. This is why you can be polite without being available. You can be respectful without being intimate. You can wish someone well without handing them the keys to your inner life again. Kindness is not the same as access. This is a sentence many people learn too late. You can answer briefly. You can remain civil. You can avoid bitterness. You can meet someone in a shared space and not create drama. But none of that means they are entitled to your emotional world. None of that means they get the long explanation, the late-night conversation, the soft tone that used to be reserved for closeness. When someone rejects you or treats you with indifference, you are allowed to adjust the distance without poisoning your character. This is especially important because wounded pride often wants to become cruel. It wants to punish. It wants to show them what it feels like. It wants to take the pain and return it with interest. But cruelty keeps you tied to the person who hurt you. You may think you are taking power back, but in reality, you are still letting them define your behavior. If their rejection turns you into someone you do not respect, then they have taken more from you than attention. They have altered your character. The Stoic aim is higher than revenge. The aim is to remain yourself under pressure. Anyone can be graceful when they are wanted, praised, chosen, and included. The real test is whether you can remain honorable when your ego has been bruised. Can you keep your standards when someone makes you feel disposable? Can you protect your peace without becoming petty? Can you create distance without hatred? This is where dignity becomes visible. Emotional distance is not a wall built from fear. It is a boundary built from wisdom. A wall says, "No one gets in because I am afraid." A boundary says, Not everyone gets in because my inner life has value. There's a quiet strength in that distinction. You are not closing yourself to love. You are closing yourself to confusion. You are not refusing connection. You are refusing access without care. This becomes practical in ordinary moments. If they message you casually after hurting you, you do not need to respond with warmth that costs you your peace. You can be brief, you can be clear, you can be kind without creating an opening for the same pattern to restart. If you see them in public, you do not need to perform bitterness. A calm greeting may be enough. If you work with them, keep the conversation focused on what is necessary. No emotional confession hidden inside professional words. No secret attempt to make them notice your pain. No emotional overgiving disguised as maturity. Because here is the truth. Some people will take your kindness as permission to continue. They will mistake your calm for availability. They will confuse your lack of anger with a lack of standards. And this is why kindness must be paired with distance. Kindness without distance becomes self-betrayal. Distance without kindness becomes bitterness. But kindness with distance becomes power. This power is not loud. It is not theatrical. It does not need to announce itself. It simply changes the terms of access. The person who once received the most vulnerable parts of you now receives only what is appropriate. The person who once occupied your emotional center now stands at the edge of your life. The person whose silence once shook your whole system now meets a version of you that is respectful, steady, and unavailable for old patterns. And this is not about pretending you are healed before you are. Sometimes distance is needed precisely because you are not healed yet. You do not place an open wound near the hand that caused it and call that strength. You protect it. You let it close. You give yourself enough separation to stop reacting from tenderness. This is not weakness. It is intelligent recovery. Marcus Aurelius wrote about meeting people who are difficult without becoming like them. That principle applies here. If someone's rejection was careless, do not become careless. If their behavior was immature, do not make immaturity your answer. If they lacked depth, do not become shallow in response. Let their conduct reveal them, but let your conduct reveal you. There is a quiet relief that comes when you understand this. You do not have to hate people to move differently around them. You do not have to expose your wounds to prove you are sincere. You do not have to keep giving emotional access just because you once did. You can change the terms. You can become more selective. You can let your kindness remain while your attachment fades. And sometimes that is the most powerful form of reverse psychology. The wounded self expects you to become reactive, bitter, or desperate. Instead, you become composed. The wounded self wants to either cling or attack. Instead, you choose distance with grace. The wounded self wants to be seen hurting. Instead, you protect your inner world until it becomes stable again. This is how rejection stops turning you into someone smaller. You remain kind enough not to be ruled by resentment, but distant enough not to be ruled by longing. And in that balance, you begin to recover a form of strength that does not need to injure anyone in order to feel real. But distance with grace also requires another discipline, knowing who deserves to see your pain and who does not. The seventh lesson is to not reveal your struggle to the wrong people. There is a kind of pain that becomes more painful when you show it to someone who cannot honor it. After rejection, the desire to be understood can become intense. You want them to know what they did. You want them to see how deeply it affected you. You want them to recognize the nights you spent thinking, the confusion you carried, the dignity you tried to maintain while feeling quietly broken. And because the pain feels invisible, you may feel tempted to make it visible. But not everyone deserves access to the evidence of your suffering. This is not because suffering is shameful. It is because your pain is sacred information. It shows where you are tender. It reveals what you hoped for. It exposes the places where you still wanted to be chosen. When you reveal that to someone who has already been careless with you, you may not receive compassion. You may give them a map of your vulnerability. The Stoic does not hide pain because he is pretending to be made of stone. He contains pain because he understands that not every audience is safe. There is a difference between honest expression and emotional exposure. Honest expression happens in the presence of people who can meet your truth with care. Emotional exposure happens when you hand your woundedness to someone who has already shown they may not know what to do with it. This is where many people damage themselves after rejection. They send paragraphs that explain everything. They describe the hurt in detail. They confess how much they waited, how much they cared, how much they felt diminished. And for a few minutes, it feels relieving. The truth is finally outside the body. But then comes the second wound, the cold reply, the silence, the misunderstanding, the polite distance, or worse, the feeling that your pain has been reduced to something inconvenient. That second wound is often worse than the first, because now you are not only rejected, you are exposed. So, be careful. Do not give your deepest emotional material to someone who has not earned the right to hold it. This does not mean you become fake. It means you become selective. You can be honest without being unguarded. You can admit that something hurt without giving a full tour of the wound. You can say, "I understand what happened, and I am taking distance," without turning the conversation into a plea for sympathy. There is strength in privacy. In a world where people turn every emotional moment into a public performance, privacy has become a form of dignity. You do not need to prove you are hurt for the pain to be real. You do not need an audience for healing to begin. You do not need the person who wounded you to validate the wound before you take care of it. And this matters because rejection can tempt you to become performative. You may want to post a quote that hints at the pain. You may want to appear happier than you are. You may want to make your silence visible, your growth visible, your strength visible, so they know exactly what they lost. But if your healing is still designed for their attention, then they remain the center of it. Even your recovery becomes a message addressed to them. That is not freedom. Freedom is when your healing no longer needs to be witnessed by the person who hurt you. Freedom is when your progress is not a performance of being over it. Freedom is when you can suffer privately, recover honestly, and rebuild quietly without turning every step into proof. This does not mean you heal alone in isolation. That would be another mistake. You need wise witnesses, a close friend, a mentor, a therapist, a person who can hear your pain without feeding your bitterness. Someone who does not simply say, "They will regret it," because that keeps the story centered on them. You need people who bring you back to yourself. People who ask, "What did this reveal? What boundary was missing? What part of you still thinks love must be earned through overgiving? What would self-respect do now?" Those are the right people to reveal your struggle to, not the person who is using ambiguity to keep access, not the person who responds only when it benefits them, not the person who enjoys being emotionally important while offering nothing steady in return. Your struggle should not become entertainment, leverage, or an invitation for someone to re-enter your life without real change. The Stoics valued inner command, but they also understood the importance of choosing your company well. The wrong company inflames pain. The right company gives pain perspective. The wrong person makes you feel ashamed for hurting. The right person helps you become responsible without becoming hard. This is the difference between dumping your wounds and processing them with wisdom. So when rejection hurts, ask yourself where the pain should go. Not every pain belongs in a message. Not every confession belongs in the hands of the person who caused it. Not every wound needs to be explained to be healed. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is keep your struggle away from those who would mishandle it, and bring it instead to places where it can become clarity. This is not suppression. Suppression says, I feel nothing. Wisdom says, I feel this deeply, but I will not expose it carelessly. Suppression hardens you. Wisdom protects you. Suppression denies the wound. Wisdom gives the wound the right environment to close. And when you stop revealing your struggle to the wrong people, something inside you begins to stand taller. You stop asking for compassion from those who gave you confusion. You stop turning your pain into an argument. You stop handing emotional evidence to people who have already shown they may not respect the case. You become more private, more grounded, more deliberate. And slowly, the need to be understood by everyone begins to fade. You realize that being misunderstood by someone careless is not a tragedy. The real tragedy would be betraying yourself to be understood by someone who still would not meet you with depth. Once your pain is no longer being exposed to the wrong people, it can finally become fuel for the right work. Not the work of revenge. The work of becoming stronger in a way that belongs to you. The eighth lesson is to demonstrate your value through action. After rejection, there is a strong desire to explain your worth. You want to say, you do not understand what I bring. You do not see what I could become. You do not know what you dismissed. This impulse is human. Rejection feels like a false judgment, and when we feel falsely judged, we want to appeal the verdict. We want to present evidence. We want to prove that the other person made a mistake. But the deepest proof of value is not an argument. It is a life. This is where the energy of rejection can be transformed, not by using it to chase the person who rejected you, but by directing it into your own growth. There is a kind of pain that can either make you smaller or more disciplined. It can either make you obsess over who did not choose you, or it can force you to ask, where have I been underdeveloped? Where have I been waiting to be validated instead of becoming undeniable to myself? What would I build if I stopped spending my strength trying to be seen by one person? This is not about proving them wrong in the childish sense. That keeps you tied to them. If your whole transformation is built on making someone regret losing you, then they still own the architecture of your growth. They remain the hidden audience. Every improvement becomes a message. Every achievement becomes an argument. Every visible sign of progress becomes a quiet attempt to be watched. That is not power. That is still dependence. The mature version is different. You demonstrate your value because your life deserves your effort, not because someone failed to recognize it. You train your body because you respect the body you live in. You develop your mind because confusion has cost you enough. You improve your work because competence creates freedom. You build your emotional discipline because being controlled by rejection has become too expensive. You become better, not as revenge, but as restoration. And this is where Stoicism becomes practical. The Stoic does not sit around demanding that the world recognize his worth. He asks whether his actions are worthy. He does not control praise. He controls conduct. He does not control whether others see his discipline. He controls whether discipline is present. He does not control reputation completely, he controls character. And character is built quietly, in repeated acts that no one may clap for at first. So, if rejection has hurt you, use the pain as material, not identity. Let it sharpen your attention. Let it reveal where you were too dependent, too available, too easily shaken, too hungry for approval. Let it show you the areas of your life that became neglected while you were trying to be chosen. Then begin there. If your health has declined because your emotions have been ruling your habits, return to your body. Walk, train, sleep with more respect. Eat in a way that does not deepen the chaos. If your work has suffered because one person's distance consumed your mind, return to your craft. Make your output cleaner. Become reliable again. If your friendships have been neglected because you kept orbiting someone who gave you uncertainty, return to the people who actually show up. If your self-image has been damaged, do something every day that gives you evidence of self-trust. That evidence matters. Confidence does not come from repeating that you are valuable while acting in ways that make you feel powerless. Confidence comes from keeping promises to yourself. Small promises, unseen promises. The promise not to check, the promise not to beg, the promise to finish the work, the promise to keep your body moving, the promise to speak to yourself without cruelty. Each promise kept becomes a small stone in the foundation of a stronger identity. This is how rejection turns into power. Not because the person who rejected you suddenly changes their mind, but because you stop using their mind as the place where your worth must be confirmed. Your value becomes something you practice, something you embody, something you refine through action. And yes, sometimes people will notice. They may notice your calm. They may notice your absence. They may notice that your life has become fuller, more focused, less available to emotional games. But by then, their noticing will no longer be the point. The real victory is when you do not need their recognition to validate the change. The real victory is when your growth feels like home, not like a performance. There is a quiet danger in becoming obsessed with being undeniable. If you are not careful, that word can become another prison. You start thinking you must become impressive enough that no one can ever reject you again. But that is impossible. Even the strongest, wisest, most disciplined person will still be rejected by someone. Rejection is not always proof of lack. Sometimes it is incompatibility. Sometimes it is timing. Sometimes it is another person's blindness. Sometimes it is life redirecting you away from a place where your soul would have had to shrink. So do not build yourself into a product that everyone must approve. Build yourself into a person you can respect. That is stronger. Because when self-respect becomes the foundation, rejection can still hurt, but it cannot erase you. It may disappoint you, but it will not define you. It may close a door, but it will not convince you that the whole world has closed. Demonstrate your value through action, not loudly, not desperately, not as a performance for the person who failed to choose you. Do it because action restores agency. Do it because discipline gives pain somewhere noble to go. Do it because every day you build yourself, you become less dependent on being rescued by someone else's approval. And when your life begins to expand beyond the rejection, you will understand something that no explanation could have taught you. The person who refused to see your worth may have forced you to finally see it yourself. But for that realization to last, your growth cannot remain a reaction to one person. It must become a whole life they are no longer the center of. The 9th lesson is to build a life they are no longer the center of. This is where rejection begins to lose its power. Not when the other person apologizes, not when they return, not when they finally understand what they lost. Rejection loses power when your life becomes too wide, too grounded, and too meaningful to revolve around the person who did not choose you. After rejection, the mind often becomes narrow. Everything points back to one person. You wake up and think about them. You work and drift back to them. You hear a song, see a place, notice a small detail, and suddenly they are present again. Your life may still have many parts, but emotionally, everything begins circling one absence. And when one person becomes the center of your inner world, their distance feels like the collapse of the whole world. That is why you must deliberately widen your life again. Not as a performance, not to show them you are happy, not to create a scene where they see you laughing, growing, becoming more attractive, more social, more successful. That is still a life built in reaction to them. You widen your life because your soul was not made to shrink around one person's inability to value you. This is one of the most important shifts in the entire episode. Many people try to overcome rejection by replacing the rejected person too quickly. They look for another person, another distraction, another source of attention, another place to feel wanted. But if you do not rebuild the center of your life, you may only transfer the same hunger to someone new. You may call it healing, but it is only relocation. The Stoic path asks for something deeper. It asks you to return to your own order, to rebuild your day, to restore your habits, to strengthen your body, to clean your environment, to reconnect with people who bring peace instead of uncertainty, to create goals that do not depend on being chosen, to become involved again in the ordinary responsibilities that make a human being stable. Because after rejection, stability is not boring. Stability is medicine. Go outside again, but not to prove you are over it. Go because sunlight reminds the body that life is larger than one emotional wound. Meet friends again, but not to fill the silence with noise. Meet them because healthy connection corrects the lie that one person's rejection means you are unwanted everywhere. Learn something new, not because constant activity will erase pain, but because growth gives the mind a future to move toward. Return to your craft, not as an escape, but as a place where your agency becomes visible again. You need experiences that remind you that you are still alive beyond the rejection. This may sound simple, but it is not. When someone has occupied your emotional center, ordinary life can feel flat without them. Food does not taste the same. Music feels different. Work feels heavier. Even joy can feel guilty, as if part of you is still waiting for permission to move on. But you must not confuse emotional withdrawal with truth. The fact that life feels empty after someone leaves does not mean they were the source of all meaning. It means your nervous system became accustomed to their presence, their attention, their possibility. And what is learned can be unlearned. Slowly, you teach your life to belong to you again. You stop measuring the day by whether they appeared in it. You stop treating their absence as the main event. You stop making your mood a servant of their behavior. You begin creating new references for identity. I am the kind of person who trains even when hurt. I am the kind of person who keeps working even when disappointed. I am the kind of person who does not abandon friends, purpose, health, and discipline because one person did not choose me. This is how self-respect becomes practical. It is not just a feeling, it is a schedule. It is a routine. It is a standard. It is the repeated decision to live in a way that proves you have not handed your entire inner world to someone else. And part of building a wider life is rebuilding your social world with maturity, not chasing status in the shallow sense, not trying to look popular, not collecting people as proof that you are desirable. That is insecurity wearing a better outfit. Real social strength is different. It means becoming connected to life again. It means contributing, participating, showing up, creating value, having conversations that are not secretly about the person who rejected you. Join the room again. Speak to people again. Share a meal. Walk with a friend. Volunteer. Learn. Travel somewhere nearby. Sit in a cafe and read without checking your phone every few minutes. Go to the gym and let your body remember that it can carry more than sadness. Take small steps into the world, not because the world will immediately heal you, but because isolation often turns pain into an echo chamber. The more your life expands, the smaller the rejection becomes. Not because it meant nothing, but because it is no longer everything. And one day, you may realize that you went several hours without thinking about them. Then a day. Then longer. And when the thought returns, it does not cut as deeply. It becomes information from a former season, not a command over your present one. This is how healing often arrives, not as a dramatic victory, but as the quiet discovery that something which used to control you now only visits you. But be careful here. Do not build a life designed to make them jealous. That is still captivity. Do not improve yourself only in ways they can see. That is still worship. Do not make your happiness a weapon. That is still dependence. Build a life that would still be worth living, even if they never knew about it. That sentence is a test. If your growth only matters when they witness it, you are not free yet. If your joy only feels satisfying when it might disturb them, you are not free yet. If your new life is secretly a message to the person who rejected you, you're still writing to them with your actions. Freedom begins when the message ends. You build because your life is yours. You heal because your peace matters. You grow because your future deserves better leadership than your wound. And as your life becomes fuller, stronger and more honest, rejection starts to take its proper size. It becomes one chapter, not the author. One closed door, not the entire landscape. One person's inability to meet you, not a final statement about what you are allowed to become. That is why the 10th lesson matters. Turn rejection into self-respect. This is the final transformation. Because if rejection only makes you colder, then it has not made you wiser. If rejection only teaches you to play games, then it has not made you stronger. If rejection only makes you obsessed with appearing powerful, then the wound is still leading. The real victory is not that you become untouchable. The real victory is that you become loyal to yourself. Self-respect is not loud. It is not the need to prove that you are above pain. It is not walking around with a hard face, pretending nothing reaches you. True self-respect is much quieter. It is the moment you stop bargaining with people who make you feel small. It is the moment you stop asking for closure from someone who keeps opening the wound. It is the moment you stop treating rejection as evidence that you should lower your standards. Rejection can become a mirror if you are brave enough to look honestly. It can show you where you were too available, where you ignored signs, where you tolerated confusion because you were afraid of losing access, where you confused intensity with intimacy, where you were more committed to being chosen than being respected. These realizations are uncomfortable, but they are useful. They return responsibility to you without turning you against yourself. That balance matters. You must not use rejection as an excuse to hate yourself. You must not say, "I was foolish, I was weak, I should have known." That kind of self-attack only deepens the wound. But you also must not avoid the lesson. You must be honest enough to say, There were places where I abandoned my own dignity. There were moments when I felt the truth and negotiated with it. There were signs I softened because I wanted the outcome more than I wanted clarity. That is not shame. That is awakening. A person with self-respect is not someone who never gets rejected. Everyone gets rejected. Everyone meets doors that do not open. Everyone gives care to places that cannot return it. Everyone misreads someone at some point. Self-respect is what happens after. It is whether you crawl after what left or stand still long enough to remember your own spine. It is whether you let one person's no become a verdict or let it become a boundary. It is whether you keep auditioning or finally step out of the room. The Stoics would remind you that your character is the only possession that fully belongs to you. Not reputation, not attraction, not popularity, not the choices of other people. Character. The way you respond when you're hurt. The way you carry disappointment. The way you protect your peace without becoming cruel. The way you refuse to trade dignity for temporary attention. This is why rejection is such powerful training. It exposes the gap between what you say you believe and how you act when you feel unwanted. It is easy to claim self-worth when everyone is validating you. It's easy to be calm when the person you want is warm. It's easy to feel strong when life is confirming your image of yourself. But rejection removes the applause. It removes the reassurance. It leaves you alone with the question, do I still stand with myself when someone else steps away? That question is the doorway. If the answer has been no in the past, do not collapse into regret. Use the truth. Maybe you chased. Maybe you begged. Maybe you over-explained. Maybe you made yourself too available. Maybe you turned someone's silence into your obsession. Maybe you gave your power away and called it love. That does not mean you are broken. It means you have located the place where self-respect must now be built. And building it will cost you something. It will cost you the fantasy that the right explanation can make careless people careful. It will cost you the addiction to being chosen by people who are inconsistent. It will cost you the habit of treating attention as proof of worth. It will cost you the old identity that believed love must be earned through emotional overgiving. But what you gain is far greater. You gain the ability to pause when pain wants you to chase. You gain the ability to stay kind without becoming available. You gain the ability to walk away without needing to destroy the person you leave behind. You gain the ability to feel rejection without turning it into self-abandonment. You gain the quiet strength of knowing that even if someone does not choose you, you will still choose yourself. That is the real reverse psychology, not manipulating others, not acting indifferent so they return, not using silence as a weapon. It is reversing the old pattern inside you. The old pattern says, if they reject me, I must prove myself. The stronger pattern says, if they reject me, I must return to myself. The old pattern says, their distance means I am less. The stronger pattern says, their distance means I must stop placing my worth in unstable hands. The old pattern says, I need them to see me. The stronger pattern says, I need to stop disappearing when they do not. And once that shift happens, everything changes. You no longer interpret rejection as a command to shrink. You no longer make one person the judge of your entire future. You no longer confuse emotional pain with personal failure. You begin to see rejection as information. Sometimes it tells you that someone was not aligned with you. Sometimes it tells you that a door was not yours. Sometimes it tells you where you were still hungry for validation. Sometimes it tells you that your standards were waiting for you to defend them. This does not make rejection painless. It makes it useful. And that may be the highest form of power available to a human being. Not the power to avoid pain, but the power to metabolize it into wisdom. To take what could have made you bitter and let it make you clearer. To take what could have made you desperate and let it make you disciplined. To take what could have made you chase and let it teach you stillness. So when rejection comes, do not rush to turn it into a story of defeat. Do not immediately ask, "Why was I not enough?" Ask a better question: what part of me is being invited back to myself? Maybe your dignity is being invited back. Maybe your discipline is being invited back. Maybe your standards are being invited back. Maybe the life you neglected while trying to be chosen is asking you to return. And when you do return, return fully. Return to your work. Return to your body. Return to your friendships. Return to your principles. Return to the quiet practices that make your mind clean again. Return to the version of you that does not need to be constantly reassured in order to stand. Return to the person who can be hurt without becoming hateful, disappointed without becoming desperate, rejected without becoming lost. Because the person who rejected you may have closed one door, but they did not close your life. They did not close your future. They did not close your ability to grow, to love, to become disciplined, to build something meaningful, to stand with more dignity than before. Their rejection is not the end of your power. It may be the first moment you truly learn where your power was supposed to live, not in their answer, not in their attention, not in their approval, but in your own ability to remain whole when the world does not give you what you wanted. That is how rejection becomes power. And that is how the person who once waited to be chosen becomes the person who finally chooses himself.